On August the 7th, 2026, three men stood together in the holy city of Mecca and signed a piece of paper that analysts are now calling the birth of a Muslim NATO. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif. Three leaders, three militaries, one nuclear arsenal, and one sentence that changes the math in the Middle East. An armed attack on any one of them will be treated as an attack on all three. If that sentence sounds familiar, it should. It is almost word for word the language of Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, the clause that has kept the peace in Europe for 75 years. Except this time, it is not Washington and Brussels writing the rules, it is Mecca. This is not a rumor, it is not a leak. It is a signed, ratified, publicly announced defense pact, and it was cemented at the exact moment the United States and Iran are locked in the 6th month of open war. To understand why this agreement matters, and why some are already calling it the moment Iran got boxed in, we need to go back and look at both halves of the picture, the deep background that built up to this day, and the very latest moves being made on the ground right now. To really understand how we got here, you have to go back further than February of this year. The hostility between Iran and its neighbors did not start in 2026. According to Britannica's background coverage, tensions between the United States and Iran stretch all the way back to the 1979 Islamic Revolution and the hostage crisis that followed, a moment that set the tone of mutual suspicion for nearly 5 decades. In 2015, 6 world powers negotiated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal designed to freeze Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. In May of 2018, during his first term, President Trump withdrew the United States from that deal, calling it, in his words, one-sided. The following year, in April of 2019, Washington formally designated Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization. Those two decisions, according to Wikipedia's background summary on the conflict, set the stage for everything that followed. The first real preview of open war came in June of 2025, in what's now known as the 12-Day War. On June the 13th, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, a surprise campaign that hit Iran's main nuclear enrichment sites at Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan, according to France 24's retrospective coverage, using more than 200 fighter jets to drop over 330 munitions on roughly 100 targets in a single opening wave. Iran responded with Operation True Promise 3, firing more than 550 ballistic missiles and over 1,000 suicide drones at Israeli cities, hitting at least one hospital and a dozen military and government sites. On June the 22nd, the United States entered directly with Operation Midnight Hammer, striking the 3 hardened nuclear facilities Israel could not fully destroy on its own. The International Atomic Energy Agency later confirmed serious damage at Natanz, Isfahan, the Tehran Research Center, Karaj, and the Iraq Heavy Water Complex, though a preliminary American intelligence assessment suggested the strikes had only set Iran's nuclear program back by months, not destroyed it outright. That war ended after 12 days with a ceasefire brokered, largely through Omani mediation. Here's the detail that actually matters for understanding 2026. According to Al Jazeera's own analysis, the 12-day war of 2025 had a defined, limited scope. It targeted nuclear and military infrastructure and specifically avoided regime leadership, which left rooms for negotiation and an actual off-ramp. The war that began in February of this year abandoned that restraint entirely. It was, in Al Jazeera's words, a drastic strategic pivot, from degrading nuclear infrastructure to executing a full decapitation strike against Iran's leadership itself. And that shift is exactly what has locked the region into what analysts now call an open-ended war of attrition with, so far, 0 diplomatic off-ramps. That's the fuse. Now, here's how it was lit. On February the 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military campaign against Iran, codenamed Operation Epic Fury. The opening strike was not aimed at a base or a missile site. It was aimed at the top of the Iranian regime itself. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed in the opening hours of the operation, according to reporting from Britannica's ongoing conflict coverage. Iran's response was immediate and massive. Hundreds of retaliatory missiles and thousands of drones fired across the region, not just at Israel, but at American bases and at Gulf Arab states that Iran accused of enabling the strikes. The fighting has since killed thousands of people across Iran, Lebanon, Israel, and the Gulf, and displaced millions. The economic shockwaves were just as severe. Dubai International Airport, one of the busiest airports on Earth, was struck by drones in the opening days of the war and had to suspend flights entirely before reopening at limited capacity. Shipping companies rerouted away from the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea before Iran had even formally threatened to close them. And then, on top of the military campaign, came the Strait of Hormuz crisis, a separate but connected emergency in which Iran threatened to shut down one of the most important oil choke points on the planet. There have been attempts to stop the bleeding. On April the 8th, 2026, the United States and Iran agreed to a 2-week ceasefire, mediated by Pakistan. President Trump extended that ceasefire indefinitely on April the 21st, but according to Wikipedia's tracking of the ceasefire and CNN's live coverage from early August, the truce has been violated repeatedly by both sides, and the United States reimposed a full naval blockade on Iran last month after the ceasefire effectively collapsed. As of August the 10th, CNN reported that direct talks between Washington and Tehran had faltered, with President Trump himself saying the U.S. is, in his words, low-keying negotiations. Iran's military advisor to the supreme leader, Mohsen Rezai, said publicly that Iran's armed forces will not stand idly by while the blockade continues, and warned that Iran will not allow any route through the Strait of Hormuz other than, in his words, Iran's own route. That is the wreckage this new alliance was born out of. A war 6 months old, a ceasefire in name only, a naval blockade squeezing Iran's economy, and a region full of countries that have been hit, directly or indirectly, by the fallout. Saudi Arabia is one of them. According to CS monitors on-the-ground reporting from Amman, Saudi Arabia was struck by Iranian drones after the war opened, an attack that directly threatened both its oil exports and its internal stability. That is the wound the Mecca Agreement is meant to treat. So let's talk about what was actually signed, because the details matter here more than the headlines. The Mecca Joint Defense Agreement is not a brand new idea invented overnight. It builds on an earlier bilateral agreement, the Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement, signed between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan back on September the 17th, 2025, roughly 11 months before the Mecca signing. According to Wikipedia's entry on the pact, that earlier deal came in the wake of an Israeli strike on Doha, Qatar, in September of last year, an attack that rattled Gulf capitals and pushed Riyadh and Islamabad closer together. What happened in Mecca this August was an expansion of that existing framework, formally bringing Turkey into the fold and elevating a bilateral arrangement into a trilateral one. The timeline of the signing itself is worth walking through because it was choreographed with real symbolic weight. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif arrived in Jeddah on August the 6th. The following day, he performed the Umrah pilgrimage in Mecca, one of the holiest acts in Islam, while Turkish President Erdogan met separately with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Then, at what the official record describes as the gracious invitation of the custodian of the two holy mosques, King Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, all three leaders came together and the collective security agreement was formally concluded in Mecca on August the 7th. This was not a phone call or a joint statement issued by press offices. This was leaders physically traveling to one of the holiest cities on earth to put their names on a defense treaty. According to the joint statement released by all three governments and reported by both Al Jazeera and CNN, the core clause reads that any armed attack against any one of the three states shall be regarded as an attack against them all. The stated rationale, according to the official joint statement, is to strengthen collective deterrence against any act of aggression and to provide for the enhancement of all aspects of defense cooperation among the three states. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan went further in an interview with Turkey's state broadcaster describing the pact as, quote, technically similar to NATO's Article 5 on collective defense. But Fidan also added an important caveat, one that a lot of headlines have quietly dropped. Joint action under the pact would depend on a formal request being made by the member state under attack, and that state would have to specify exactly what kind of support it needs. In other words, this is not an automatic trigger. It is a framework for a request and response process, not a machine that fires on its own. There's one more question hanging over this whole agreement, and it's the one that has generated the most disagreement among analysts. Does this pact effectively hand Saudi Arabia a nuclear umbrella through Pakistan? The Saudi-Pakistani military relationship goes back much further than last year. According to the Strategic Vision Institute, the bond dates to a 1967 defense deal, the same year King Faisal of Saudi Arabia called Pakistan the citadel of Islam. Since then, Pakistan has trained somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 Saudi military personnel, and it currently keeps an estimated 1,500 to 2,000 of its own troops stationed inside the kingdom in training and advisory roles, according to the Belfer Center at Harvard. Saudi Arabia, in turn, has poured more than $30 billion into Pakistan's economy since the 1980s, and the kingdom is home to more than 2.5 million Pakistani expatriates, according to the Stimson Center. When the original bilateral pact was signed back in September of 2025, a Reuters reporter asked a Saudi official point blank whether it meant Pakistan would extend its nuclear arsenal to protect the kingdom. The official's answer was carefully vague. This is a comprehensive defensive agreement that encompasses all military means. That single sentence has fueled a year of dueling interpretations. The Belfer Center and the Strategic Vision Institute both argue the nuclear umbrella framing is overhyped, pointing out that Pakistan's nuclear doctrine has always been focused on deterring India, not on defending the Gulf, and that Pakistan has entered defense for pacts before, including declining to send combat troops to the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen back in 2015, without any of them triggering automatic military entanglement. On the other side, the Stimson Center, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, and multiple other outlets argue the practical effect is real regardless of the legal fine print. Saudi Arabia, a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that does not possess its own weapons, now sits under the informal shadow of a nuclear-armed ally's arsenal, including Pakistan's Shaheen-3 missile, which has a range of roughly 2,750 kilometers, comfortably enough to reach anywhere in the region. Neither Pakistan nor Saudi Arabia has ever officially confirmed a nuclear dimension to the pact, and that deliberate ambiguity, according to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, may be the entire point. A signal to Washington, Tehran, and Israel all at once that the old rules of who guarantees Gulf security no longer fully apply. Now here is where the three countries bring very different things to the table, and understanding this is the key to understanding why analysts are taking this pact seriously instead of dismissing it as symbolic theater. Pakistan brings extensive combat and counterinsurgency experience, and it is, according to PBS News, the only nuclear-armed country in the Muslim world. That nuclear status is not written explicitly into the pact's text, but multiple analysts, including Murad Sadiqzadi of the Middle East Studies Center, have noted that Pakistan's nuclear capability likely provides the alliance with what he calls a deterrent effect, the classic logic of collective deterrence. A potential adversary may hesitate before attacking any one member for fear of triggering a coordinated response from three separate militaries. Saudi Arabia, for its part, brings enormous financial and political weight and is the world's largest oil exporter. And Turkey brings something the other two don't have: full NATO membership, a large standing military, and an increasingly sophisticated domestic defense industry that has already been exporting drones and military hardware across the region. It's worth putting real numbers behind Turkey's contribution, because large military and sophisticated defense industry can sound like a vague talking point until you see the scale involved. According to Al Monitor's reporting from earlier this month, Turkey's defense and aviation exports hit $5.79 billion in the first 7 months of 2026 alone, up more than 26% year over year, with the country's 12-month export total climbing to $11.2 billion, according to figures released by Turkey's defense industry agency. A huge share of that growth is driven by Baykar, the company behind the Bayraktar TB2 and Akıncı combat drones, which the Jerusalem Post reports now supplies weapons to nearly 40 countries across the Gulf, Africa, and Asia, precisely because buyers see Turkish drones as cheaper, faster to deliver, and more adaptable than Western alternatives. Turkey's drone diplomacy has already reached Saudi Arabia directly. Saudi Arabian military. Industry signed a deal with Turkish autonomous systems firm ULQ back in February to jointly develop unmanned surface vehicles inside the kingdom, on top of an earlier 2023 agreement to localize Baykar drone manufacturing on Saudi soil. That is not a coincidence. It is the industrial backbone underneath the diplomatic handshake in Mecca, years of defense sector integration between Ankara and Riyadh that predate the formal signing of the pact itself. Put those three together, and you get, as one countercurrents analysis put it, a bloc combining a NATO member, a nuclear power, and the world's largest oil exporter and a leading voice of the Muslim world, all under one collective defense umbrella. That is not a small thing. That is a new center of gravity in a region that has spent decades depending almost entirely on American security guarantees. So does this pact actually target Iran? Here, the record gets genuinely contested, and a responsible account has to sit with that tension rather than flatten it. Officially, no. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar said publicly, in a post reported by PBS News, that the agreement is, quote, purely defensive in nature, and that other countries are welcome to join if they are willing to uphold its principles and resolve disputes peacefully. Turkey's Fidan was even more direct with Al Jazeera, stating flatly, quote, there is no common threat that we have put in writing, and adding that countries which do not attack the signatories will not be considered targets under the pact. But unofficially, the picture reported by multiple outlets looks different. CNN's Middle East desk described the Mecca agreement as serving, in effect, as a warning to Tehran that another major attack on Saudi Arabia could invoke the pact, draw in Pakistan and Turkey, and dramatically widen the war beyond its current borders. And the reaction from inside Iran itself has been genuinely mixed, which is worth being upfront about rather than picking the version of events that makes for the cleaner story. CNN reported that a senior Iranian official, Ebrahim Rezai, a member of the Iranian parliament's National Security and Foreign Policy Committee, dismissed the pact publicly on social media platform X, saying, quote, "The Saudis should understand that a paper agreement with Turkey and Pakistan will not bring them security, just as decades of one-sided dependence on the Americans failed to do so. That is a pointed, dismissive response from a sitting Iranian lawmaker." At the same time, a separate report circulating from the geopolitical analysis site Sonar 21 claims Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Arashi, struck a notably different tone, describing Iran's armed forces as having shown their readiness and capability, and framing the moment as one where, quote, "Muslims standing together can face challenges from what he called malicious outsiders." That source is less independently verified than CNN or Al Jazeera, and it should be treated with appropriate caution, but it does reflect a real strand of commentary suggesting some voices inside Iran's government are choosing to frame the pact as pan-Islamic solidarity rather than as a direct threat aimed at Tehran. The honest takeaway here is that Iran's government does not speak with one unified voice on this pact, and anyone telling you there is a single official Iranian reaction is oversimplifying a genuinely split response. Outside analysts are similarly divided on how much this actually changes on the battlefield. Huda al-Badi, an Emirati researcher and foreign policy expert, told the Jerusalem Post that the pact was, in her words, a paper tiger, and she raised a sharper concern, that the alliance risks casting Israel as the destabilizing power in the region, rather than Iran, at a moment when Iran has been the one launching drone and missile strikes on Gulf states. On the other side of that argument, Sadegh Zaid's analysis, published this week, framed the Mecca Pact as something bigger than a simple anti-Iran or anti-Israel bloc. His conclusion is that it represents regional states trying to build what he calls greater strategic autonomy in an uncertain international system, a hedge against the possibility that American security guarantees, which have underpinned Gulf security for decades, may simply not be as reliable going forward as they once were. He points out an irony that is hard to miss. The Middle East NATO that Washington itself floated as an idea for years, mostly as an anti-Iran coalition built around Israel and the Gulf states, may now be emerging in a completely different form, one that does not put the United States or Israel anywhere near its center. It's worth pausing here to explain just how much is riding on this economically, because the Mecca Pact was not signed in a vacuum. It was signed with the global economy already reeling. When Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz closed on March the 4th, 2026, and began threatening and carrying out attacks on ships attempting to transit it, according to Congressional Research Service reporting, the fallout was immediate. Wikipedia's tracking of the war's economic impact shows Brent crude surging past $120 a barrel, with the International Energy Agency calling it the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Qatar Energy was forced to declare force majeure on all of its exports. Combined oil production from Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE dropped by more than 10 million barrels a day by mid-March. The World Bank's commodity markets outlook for 2026 confirmed global oil output fell by nearly 7% year over year in the second quarter alone, the sharpest quarterly decline since the COVID-19 pandemic. Analysts at Wood Mackenzie modeled scenarios where, if the strait stayed closed through the end of this year, Brent crude could approach $200 a barrel and Middle East GDP could contract by more than 10%. Even the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas ran its own model and estimated the closure alone could cut annualized global growth by nearly 3 percentage points in a single quarter. Countries as far away as Vietnam reported fuel shortages and panic buying at gas stations, according to Wikipedia's summary of the broader fuel crisis. This is the backdrop the Mecca Alliance was born into, a world already absorbing what officials are calling a historic energy shock, with 3 regional powers now stepping in, to say, in effect, that they intend to set new terms for stability rather than simply wait on Washington to restore it. There is a strategic complication baked into this pact that is worth walking through carefully, because it explains why some call the arrangement risky as much as reassuring. Turkey is a full NATO member. If Turkey were ever pulled into a shooting war with Iran under the terms of the Mecca Agreement, it raises a real question about how that intersects with NATO's own Article 5 obligations to Turkey, since a NATO member being attacked can, in theory, draw in the entire 32-nation alliance. CNBC has reported on exactly this tension in the context of the broader Iran war. Turkey has already reported an Iranian missile shot down over its territory, and a British base in Cyprus was targeted by a drone that the UK's Ministry of Defense said was not launched from Iranian soil, even though the drone type is closely associated with Iran's Shahed family of one-way attack drones. NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte has acknowledged that alliance members are, in his words, feeling the heat from the war, though NATO itself reportedly did not treat the Cyprus drone incident as significant enough to warrant formal alliance-level discussions. Analysts told CNBC that Turkey would strongly prefer to avoid direct entanglement in the Iran war, but that Ankara would likely consider direct retaliation if Iran ever targeted Turkish territory deliberately and unambiguously. Layer the Mecca Pact on top of that existing NATO tension, and you start to see why some observers describe this new alliance not just as a shield for Saudi Arabia, but as a genuinely dangerous new tripwire, one member's conflict potentially dragging in the other two, exactly the entrapment dynamic that collective defense pacts have always carried as their built-in risk. There's also a broader ripple effect worth mentioning, because alliances like this rarely stay contained to the countries that sign them. Sadig Zaid's analysis notes that this new arrangement gives all of its members more room to maneuver diplomatically. Saudi Arabia can keep working with Washington while also deepening ties with Turkey and Pakistan. Turkey can remain inside NATO while simultaneously building independent regional security arrangements of its own. And the analysis goes further, suggesting that Russia and China could ultimately benefit from all of this, since Middle Eastern states seeking more strategic autonomy from the West are likely to expand their military, technological, and diplomatic relationships beyond the traditional American and European sphere. Whether or not that prediction plays out, it captures something real. This pact is not just about Iran. It is a signal that Gulf and regional powers are actively hedging their bets on the future of American involvement in Middle Eastern security. So where does that leave things right now, as of this week? The Mecca Joint Defense Agreement is officially open to new members, according to Pakistan's foreign minister, provided any joining country is willing to resolve its disputes through peaceful means. That detail matters, because it means we could be looking at the early skeleton of a larger bloc rather than a finished, closed alliance. Meanwhile, the war that produced this pact shows no sign of resolving. The naval blockade on Iran remains in place. According to U.S. Central Command's own figures, reported by CNN, the blockade has already redirected 44 commercial vessels, disabled 2, and boarded 2 more since it was reimposed. Talks over reopening the Strait of Hormuz, mediated in part by Oman, continue without a breakthrough. And President Trump, as of August the 10th, said any resumption of serious talks with Iran would require what he called compensation from Tehran, a precondition that Iran has shown no public sign of accepting. Let's be honest about what we don't know, because that is just as important as what we do know. We do not know whether the Mecca Pact will ever actually be invoked. We do not know whether Iran's more conciliatory voices, like Foreign Minister Araghchi, or its more dismissive voices, like lawmaker Ebrahim Rezai, better represent where Tehran's actual policy is heading. We do not know whether other countries, Qatar, the UAE, Egypt, or others, will eventually join the framework, or whether it stays a 3-country arrangement. And we do not know how NATO itself would respond in the scenario analysts are most worried about. A direct Turkish military response to an Iranian strike, one that could theoretically pull the entire North Atlantic alliance into a Middle Eastern war it never asked to fight. What we do know, and what is fully verified across multiple independent sources including Al Jazeera, CNN, PBS News, and the Associated Press's regional coverage, is this. On August the 7th, 2026, in the city of Mecca, 3 of the Muslim world's most significant military and economic powers signed a mutual defense pact explicitly modeled on NATO's own founding principle. It happened in the middle of an active, unresolved war between the United States and Iran. And whether you believe the official line that it targets no one, or the widely reported subtext that it is squarely aimed at deterring further Iranian aggression against the Gulf, one thing is not in dispute. The security map of the Middle East looks different this month than it did at the start of the year. To sum up where the sourcing stands, the core facts of the Mecca Joint Defense Agreement, its signing date, its signatories, and its Article 5 style language are confirmed by Al Jazeera, CNN, PBS News, and Wikipedia's sourced entry on the pact. The war background, Operation Epic Fury, the killing of Iran's supreme leader, the ceasefire collapse, and the naval blockade, is confirmed by Britannica's ongoing conflict coverage and CNN's live reporting from early August. What remains genuinely contested is Iran's true unified reaction to the pact, since mainstream reporting from CNN points to public dismissal from at least one senior Iranian official, while a less established source suggests a more conciliatory tone from Iran's foreign minister. That contradiction has not been resolved in the public record as of this recording, and it should be treated as an open question rather than a settled fact. So here's what's actually worth asking yourself after all of this. Is a defense pact built around Mecca, bringing together Saudi financial power, Turkish military capability, and Pakistani nuclear deterrence, actually going to change Iran's calculations in this war? Or is it, as one Analyst bluntly put it, just a paper tiger that sounds impressive in a headline but changes very little on the ground. We'd genuinely like to know what you think. Drop your take in the comments, and we'll see you in the next one.